The motto for our Legends Project, the motto, presenting the story of one exceptional teacher facilitates exceptional teaching. I'm particularly proud as I began my journey to step down as Dean of Libraries on June 30 of this year, to be able to say that this is probably one of the last times that I will get to speak in public. But Joyce, you make us so proud, and you are indeed a legend of this campus. I'm now proud to introduce Professor Fred Anderson from our History Department, who will introduce the program for today. Fred?
My role is as Master of Ceremonies, which means I have almost no role at all. The real substantive academic assessments and comment will come from colleagues whom I will introduce as we go along, and we hope that the sequence will make sense to you all and illuminate Joyce's career and life as a member of this community, as a scholar and a teacher. We wouldn't even know about this, however, were it not for this marvelous series, the CU Legends. And of course, that requires somebody to do the work. And so before I do any of those other presentations of personages, their information-filled topics, I need to call Andrew Violet up so people can thank him for that marvelous display downstairs. So Andrew, come this way. Were it not for him, none of this would have happened. And I would myself have been spared a wonderful lunch at his expense, which was more than ample payment for this, for the small part I played in this. But really, Andrew, thank you. I think on all our behalves, it's a wonderful job, and it's a wonderful display.
Thank you. Here, here.
All right. Well then, as I said, it's my pleasure to be here to introduce other speakers. And I won't even begin to try to take you through that marvelous display downstairs, because you should all go and see it for yourselves. What I'll do instead is just offer a few comments, not very long, I'll be short, which is inevitable with me. So an MC, you know, they tell the jokes, they keep the stuff fast and loose like that. So I'll be short, but I wanted to say just a few words about the phases of Joyce's life, and to try to put some context, maybe even a little more than the wall copy provides in the display downstairs, around them. Because I think that all of them fit together in a kind of marvelous way, and one that has made Joyce the remarkable person that she is now. So the first thing that I think we need to acknowledge is that Joyce's life begins in a period when colonial America still existed. And your years in Hawaii were very much years in an American colony, which is an experience that I've tried to study for my whole career. Although those colonies were, you know, around in the 17th and 18th centuries rather than the 20th, they still operated on more or less the same system and the same basis as Hawaii did as part of the American Commonwealth in the 1920s and 30s. That is to say, it was a place from which wealth was extracted by the exploitation of native and imported labor to produce a commodity for sale in a domestic market. Joyce had no idea between the ages of 3 and 13, what she was getting into when she was there, but what she did understand about it was that this was a kind of place that was lovely and a wonderful spot to grow up in, and that it was full of people who looked very different from her, a girl from Minnesota, descended from New Englanders going back to however far they go back, I guess, at least to Johnny Appleseed, right? She's a Chapman, you know. That was John Chapman's last name. So they were unlike her, and only with time, I think, did it actually dawn on Joyce that they were in a position of considerable disadvantage. And unlike her, in some sense, in that she belonged to a group that seemed to be in charge in Hawaii. Now, these are realizations that dawn with time, and Joyce was only in Hawaii originally for about 10 years, but old enough when you left to feel like you'd lost something. And where you went next, Minneapolis, is unlike Hawaii, in that it's colder and whiter in every sense. And that, of course, was where she first encountered, as a teenager really, a kind of American culture that was different from the one that you inhabited and grew up in Hawaii. Now, here's a point to make, right? That what you understand about the world, you understand by contrast. And so here, in the midst of a high school environment that would have been for other kids of your age exactly this sort of ordinary, normal way of life, it wasn't for you. Couldn't be, because you saw it from outside. And then after college, after the degree in Asian history, which must have had something to do with close contact with Asia, even at that distant remove. After that, you went to a place where you were really outside and an outsider, Harvard. Now, this is my favorite slide, I'll tell you, in all the ones that appear on the copy downstairs. My favorite one is Joyce sitting in an armchair with the columns of Widener Library behind her. Because that was a place where you went to graduate school in 1951, I think, which was 55. That's right. Yes, I beg your pardon. In 55, this was a place that was still dominated, as it would be for a long time, by a kind of Mandarin professorate, who basically didn't care whether you lived or died, but expected you to do whatever you could to get the degree that you were after. In this case, in Joyce's case, a Ph.D. in Japanese history of all things, where it was a brand new field, dominated by men who had learned Japanese at places like CU during World War II as part of their military obligation. And so you stood out there as much as you would have stood out in Hawaii, you know, among your friends. Here in Cambridge, you stood out as somebody who was from a sort of a double provincial background. So what difference does that make? Well, at least for me, and I experienced a little later at that same institution, what it meant was that one found oneself in the library. And that was a place where you really could do the thing that you have to do in graduate school, which is lose yourself in a subject. And there's nothing like Widener for doing that, where you can wind up in the bowels of this place and not even be able to find your way out. Where tunnels lead off in directions that no one has explored, where you no doubt find the skeletons of Cotton Mather and others from its past squirreled away. So thence, Joyce encountered American academia, which was not geared for ambitious, academically ambitious young women at that point, not if they intended to enter the professoriate. And when Joyce got her degree in 1958, or yes, 59, wait, my notes, 58, yes. Thanks, I'm glad I have somebody here to correct me on this, because my handwriting the light's bad and my handwriting's small, and so I'll screw this up. When she collected her PhD, the normal course of things in academia then was to be hired, was for one's professor to get a telephone call from somebody, some distant point, and say, we have a job in such and such history, who have you got? And that's how people got hired. They were simply sort of dispatched. There wasn't typically a long graduated period of apprenticeship where you go from one-year job to one-year job to finally, if you're lucky, land a tenure-track job, as is the case now. But rather, if you were from a good place and a good advisor, and there was nobody superior to Edmund O. Reischauer as an advisor in Japanese history, if that was the case, your ticket was pretty well written. But Joyce wound up doing 2 years of apprenticeship, visiting professorships, I think they would have been called, first at UT Austin and then at Rutgers in Newark. Jobs without a future, because academia in the late 1950s in America was dominated by men who had families to raise and pay for, and women tended not to get considered for professorships because they were in a different category. They could either be wives or they could be something else, I suppose, but they were not the first on the list. So Joyce only landed at CU in 1962, and in a tenure-track job, thank goodness, which worked out okay for you, I gather. It's ups and downs, but still in all, a good place where you were back in the provinces again. So having seen the metropole, that is to say of American academia, now you were back at a place which was located in a town of 40,000 people, which had a student body of about 12,500, of whom 10,000 were undergraduates. In other words, it was a little bigger than a high-powered liberal arts college would be today. And it had a small but growing graduate program, and it was beginning to grow from a kind of provincial university into a real research university in a very exciting way right then in the early 1960s. And that would have been the place you came to down a toll road from Denver, where you had to pay 25 cents to get to Boulder. So this was a very different world, and it was a really small world. The faculty was comparatively speaking tiny. The undergraduate teaching obligation predominated, and actually the place was in some serious flux, and you didn't know it at the time when you took the job, but when you came in the fall of '62, CU was in the grip of an athletic scandal. Imagine that. Because the coach, whose name was Sonny Grandelius, had been doing things that the National Collegiate Athletic Association frowns on. In fact, he'd been tearing up the rules and throwing them away, but he'd gotten us to the Orange Bowl. And so the president of the university, Quig Newton, was in the process of trying to fire him, which ignited an incredible set of controversies, which led ultimately to Newton's forced resignation and an investigation of, believe it or not, the political views of leftist professors on the University of Colorado campus. CU, in other words, became, in the fall of 1962, the first year you were here, that became a political football that effectively challenged academic freedom, that pretty much destroyed the career of a gifted president, Quig Newton, and wound up with Senator Barry Goldwater, no one less than that, denouncing CU as the least hospitable place he'd ever tried to give a speech because he was heckled here over in Mackay by the Young Socialists League. He took that all the way to 1964 and denounced CU, among other places, like it as presidential candidate. So Joyce can only be thought to have wondered, what in the world have I done? Why am I here? What is this place? Why would I want to be here? And so she made a career for herself. And what I would do to frame that career more briefly than I have the run-up to it is this. It is to say that historians like to classify themselves according to a scheme that, Isaiah Berlin proposed in a famous essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox. Historians tend to categorize themselves, at least flatteringly, as people who either have one big idea, like a hedgehog, or know many things, like a fox. And their scholarship tends to reflect that. This doesn't have much to do with Berlin's actual argument in that essay, but it's a sort of a shorthand way to categorize the way historians approach their work and their teaching. And Joyce wasn't like that, actually, because she was following her interests in ways that were not easily categorizable. She'd come here with a dissertation on a Meiji political figure, and I suppose it's possible to call him a bureaucrat, who was it was a very conventional Ph.D. thesis of the sort that were written in the 1950s. Body of sources that could be identified and could be exhausted in the course of the thesis, in the process of exhausting the writer of the thesis. So she came with that in her pocket and could have immediately done what people do with those kinds of things now, which is to turn that into the first excavation from a mine of information. In other words, most of us, many of us at least, are people who are trained in an area and become a specialist in a field where we burrow deep and never get out of our period. We become, in other words, like hard rock miners. We go deeper and deeper into an era or a subject matter. And in Joyce's case, 19th century Japan, there was plenty to do there. But she didn't follow that pattern at all. Instead, she took off, I think gratefully, probably gratefully, on another Fulbright to get out of Boulder, to get as far away as you could from what you'd found here, back to Japan, where, interestingly enough, you encountered this largely unknown intersection between Japanese empire and Indian independence, and that became your great subject. So Joyce wasn't like a miner, and if we're going to stick to analogies drawn from the West, since we're in the West, then this wasn't a career made on the mining frontier, digging deeper and deeper into a single subject, but rather like a sort of explorer, following sources that led Joyce, well, from 19th century Japan to mid-20th century Pacific. And Japan's relationship to the Indian movement for independence. It led her into military history, in other words, which is a field that almost no women did, and made her even more distinctive and more unusual than she otherwise would have been as a female academic in history. And she followed that out through 2 books, Jungle Alliance and Japanese Trained Armies in Southeast Asia, which were remarkable. I mean, they're distinguishing works, as I understand it, in the field, and stand well today, and have been reissued in new forms as recently as 2008. And this led on and on and on through the mid-1970s, when she changed course again, when your interests changed from diplomatic and military history, which you could have mined forever, because you had been in the Japanese military archives, right? Which weren't that easy to get into, and certainly weren't that easy for Western women to get into, and had found wealths of stuff you could have mined, but you didn't mine it. You kept looking, and instead wound up following out a hint in a source about the Rani of Jhansi. Who was that? Which led to another book and to a novel. And a fascination as well along the way with voice. And this was, if in my view, I guess, the point at which your career branches into parallel paths, one of which has to do with exploring the place of women in the world and their perspective on their historically conditioned position and culturally conditioned position in the world. And they're telling of it. So while Joyce was in the process of exploring this Indian topic, which led ultimately to Women Against the Raj in 2008, she was also writing about women in changing Japan, women in Southeast Asia, women in India, and women in Hawaii. All of them at work, all of them leading lives of historical consequence, all of them telling their stories through Joyce and her as informants to Joyce and her co-authors, co-editors of these books on women's perspectives and women's voices. Now this, I would argue, is a heck of a career. It's not spent down a mine. It's out following sources. It's exploring territory that hadn't been explored before historiographically, where the questions weren't even set yet. That's a powerfully creative act, and it's a bold one, and it didn't necessarily get you much thanks along the way. But it's a career that's a model, or should be a model, for all of us. And it's one that I wish I had before me and more in mind as I traveled down the mine over and over again in the late 18th century British North America field. Because it's an exciting way to make a living and a way to make a life. And for that, I think you're an example to us all, not just a legend and not just a pioneer, but an actual exemplar. And with that, I'm going to yield this lectern to people who actually know what they're talking about, specialists in the fields that Joyce has contributed to and indeed constructed. So our first speaker, the first knowledgeable speaker, is Miriam Kingsburg, who is a relatively new faculty member here, fairly recently promoted to the rank of associate professor with her Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley, 2009. She was hired at the University of Colorado in the fall of 1910 and disappeared immediately, was gone for 2 years. We had sort of forgotten she existed until she came back with, a book in hand, and then left again almost immediately with another prestigious fellowship, the Risk Camp, which took her off for another 2 years from 2014 to 16. Finally came back, having published a great book and gotten promoted to tenure, and now she's about to go off again to Princeton in 2017 and 18. We hope we can bring you back, Miriam, because you're a great colleague. And her work is in Japanese history of a very inventive sort of a cultural history of drug addiction so far and its meanings. The way that Japan stakes a kind of claim to nationhood and state legitimacy in the opposition to narcotics and narcotic trade. And this book, Moral Nation, which was published in 2013, and other articles in learned journals, have established Miriam as one of the young leaders in her field and someone whom we're very lucky to have. And she will orient you. Oh, sorry about that. She will orient you. I can't do it another way, to Joyce's work on Japan. And so Miriam, if you would, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that too kind introduction, and now I'm quite happy to get back to celebrating Joyce's career. But many thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. It's really an honor to be able to pay tribute to Dr. Lebra, who is very much my predecessor here in the study of modern Japan. So I'm just going to say a few words about some of the work that she did and contributions that she made to the field of Japanese history. So as we already heard, Joyce's first research project was her Ph.D. dissertation, which was ultimately published by the Australian National University Press under the title Okema Shigenobu, Statesman of Meiji Japan. So the subject of this biography was born in 1838, at which point Japan had been under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate for more than 2 centuries. So based in modern-day Tokyo, the shogunate was a strong central authority that claimed to govern on behalf of the emperor in Kyoto. And during the years of Tokugawa rule, Japan closed itself to most contact with the outside world, and voluntary seclusion laid the foundation for a long period of stability and peace, resulting in considerable growth in the cities and villages. But in the 1850s, the imperialist aggressions of the great powers of the West forced Japan to open up to foreign trade and exchange, and together with a long list of domestic issues, this policy shift destabilized and delegitimized the Tokugawa government. Activists within Japan's elite warrior class, the samurai, carried out a violent revolution against the shogunate. They claimed to be acting in support of direct rule by the emperor, but in fact, they retained power into their own hands. And during the ensuing Meiji period from 1868 to 1912, a coterie of mostly young former samurai governed Japan as an oligarchy, so as a small group of non-elected authorities. Among them was Okema Shigenobu. The goal of the oligarchs was to modernize, westernize, and industrialize Japan, thus consolidating it as a nation state and forestalling colonization attempts by the Western powers. In his youth, Okema studied Western science and thought, which he saw as the basis of national wealth and power. He developed a corresponding antipathy towards Japanese philosophy and calligraphy. In fact, he referred to Chinese characters as the devil's characters, and advocated the reform of the Japanese language. So one of the most interesting details in the book that Joyce shares is that as a result of his distaste for handwriting, there are no extant examples of his handwriting after the age of 15. This from a major statesman. Fortunately, he left behind many document collections, which provided a rich source base for her book. So in many ways, Okema was a representative political figure for his age. He enjoyed a long and varied career at the forefront of national politics, eventually serving as Japan's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Home Affairs, Minister of Agriculture and Commerce, and even Prime Minister in 1898 and again in 1914 to 1916. Yet, unlike many of his fellow oligarchs, Okema never traveled or studied abroad, believing that his duty to his country was too important to delegate to others. At the end of his life, he regretted that. Okema also differed from his colleagues in his unusual regard for democracy. Unlike his fellow oligarchs, who upheld the Neo-Confucian view that only men of elite status had the ideological qualifications to rule, Okema endorsed the democratic belief that all citizens were capable of participating in national affairs. A charismatic personality, he was a leader in the creation of the political party system and the founder of Waseda University, a private alternative to state higher education. He also established a college for women. And his own elite status notwithstanding, he deplored the reactionary tendencies of many other Meiji office holders. This won him few friends in government, but considerable adulation from the public. And upon his death in January 1922, an estimated 1.5 million people braved the elements to pay their respects to his funeral cortege. Even today, he's relatively favorably regarded compared to many of the oligarchs. So I'll wrap up my discussion of Joyce's work on Okema by sharing his thoughts on the importance of public opinion and the voice of the people. As Prime Minister in 1914, he told journalists, quote, "It is your business to criticize me if you think that I'm wrong, but let me explain to you my position and my point of view, so that you may criticize my actual policy. Without criticism by the people, politicians become demoralized, statesmen become political merchants, and politics becomes commerce. With constant criticism, politics may improve." I think these are inspiring words for many eras. So next I'd like to talk about a very different but no less interesting writing by Joyce. In November 1970, she published an eyewitness account in the New York Times of the suicide of Mishima Yukio, one of Japan's foremost novelists. Before presenting this episode, though, while I was looking this up in the New York Times, I discovered that this was not Joyce's only appearance in the paper. In barely 6 months earlier, she was interviewed in connection with a major and somehow forgotten scandal in the history department here at CU. So I'll just read the first couple sentences of this May 1970 article. Quote, "Police have made little headway tracing an associate professor who has been missing for more than a year. Thomas Riha was 40 years old at the time of his disappearance. Since that time, the only traces of him have been his wedding ring, discovered in the house of a man mysteriously poisoned, and letters and documents suspected to be forgeries. The last person reported to have seen Mr. Riha is Mrs. Galva Tannenbaum, 39, an ex-convict who is currently charged with 6 felonies and a misdemeanor and is being held in the Boulder County Jail." The New York Times went on to say that Mrs. Tannenbaum had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, that her name was an alias, and that the woman in question had previously served 2 years in the state penitentiary of Illinois, and that she was also under investigation for poisoning a female friend with sodium cyanide. Other suspects in the case included Dr. Riha's wife, from whom he had filed for divorce 2 weeks before his disappearance, and the CIA, given that he was a historian of Russia at the height of the Cold War. At the time of writing, he was presumed dead, with Joyce sagely telling the paper, "I don't think anyone has any other theory at this point." I couldn't resist following up this story. Mrs. Tannenbaum died in an insane asylum about a year later, and apparently Dr. Riha was cited in Czechoslovakia in 1973. But the CIA refused to reveal the names of the witnesses. Anyway, back to Japanese history. In November 1970, Joyce was the sole non-Japanese observer of the last words of the writer who used the pen name Mishima Yukio. So to date, Mishima is probably best known for his semi-autobiographical first novel, Confessions of a Mask, which I've assigned in my classes before. Published in 1949 to immediate critical acclaim, Confessions details Mishima's complex inner life, including the awakening of his sexuality and various homoerotic fantasies as a child and a youth in a highly constrained and charged family atmosphere. Set amid the outbreak of Japan's war against Asia and the West, Confessions also conveys Mishima's sense of shame for not having served in the Imperial Army. He was diagnosed as medically unfit due to tuberculosis, though he didn't in fact have the disease and may have deliberately misled his doctors to avoid conscription. Historians have linked his ensuing sense of survivor guilt and failure, which he never seemed to fully expiate, to his espousal of militant nationalism. In 1960, millions of protesters representing a cross-section of society agitated against the renewal of Japan's military alliance with the United States and support for the American political agenda in Asia. In response, Mishima turned sharply right, urging a return to the direct rule of the emperor and the rearming of Japan. These proposals directly contravened the post-war Japanese constitution, which reduced the emperor to a symbolic figurehead and permanently renounced war and the maintenance of air, land, and sea forces. In fact, however, in the 1950s, Japan did create the 6th largest army in the world under the euphemism of self-defense forces. To most Japanese who had lived through the hardships of militarism and war in the 1930s and early 1940s, and then of defeat and occupation in the 1940s and early 1950s, Mishima's convictions appeared anachronistic and even absurd. The novelist's suicide was a final attempt to provoke a reactionary revolution, as well as a response to his waning creative powers and reputation, and as a performance of his lifelong fascination with patriotic self-sacrifice and glorious death. On the evening of November 24th, 1970, he and 4 members of his private militia stormed the Selfdefense force base in downtown Tokyo. The group took the ranking general hostage, tying him up and demanding that he arrange an opportunity for Mishima to address the soldiers. The following day, Joyce, by coincidence, an exact contemporary of Mishima, unsuspectingly came to undertake research on World War II in the War History Library at the base. Around noon, her work was interrupted by the sound of sirens and of people gathering in the courtyard. So I'll just quote the incident description that she gave to the New York Times. I decided that World War II could wait a little longer for my attention, but what was happening outside couldn't. I left the building and mingled with the Selfdefense force troops and civilian employees who filled the yard. Suddenly, people began murmuring, "Yukio Mishima." Someone called over a loudspeaker, asking everyone to gather in front of the building. Suddenly, on the balcony appeared a face I recognized from the dust jackets of many novels. It was Yukio Mishima, dressed in a uniform modeled on a World War II officer's uniform, and with a white cloth tied around his head. He and a follower unfurled 2 white sheets covered with writing over the front of the balcony. The banners exhorted everyone to gather around and listen. He stepped forward and began his balcony speech without benefit of a microphone. He called, "What kind of army is this? What does 20 years of training since the end of the war mean? What Japan needs is a real army. You must revise the Constitution and build a real army. The self-defense force is too lax to be able to preserve the imperial way. Corrupt post-war politics have departed from the imperial way." So I've had some interesting archival experiences myself, but nothing this dramatic. Mishima spoke for about 12 minutes while the crowd heckled him mercilessly, yelling words like baka, or idiot. He then retreated to the general's office, where he committed ritual suicide, or seppuku, by cutting his stomach before his lever, acting as his second, attempted to strike off his head from behind. In the end, he needed some assistance from a third comrade, and as the police arrived, the lever followed Mishima into death. Mishima probably died knowing that he had failed to inspire a return to pre-war militarism, but he was and is revered by the ultra-right-wing faction of Japanese politics. In recent years, this movement has increased in strength, fed by a new generation of Japanese youth, born decades after World War II, who feel antagonized by the complicated issues of war memory and who view themselves as victims of globalization and the persistent ailing of the national economy. Japan's current Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who met with Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. only a couple of months ago, was elected in part thanks to his appeal to this faction. But returning to Joyce's significance to the development of the modern Japan history field, it seems to me appropriate to situate her career between the study of Okema Shigenobu and Mishima Yukio. In these two men, we can find many of the trends that historians identify as most significant in the century from about 1870 to 1970. Nation building, economic development, democratization, the transformation of aesthetic sensibilities, ultranationalism, militarism, political cronyism, and the cultivation of a national and international reputation, to name just a few. In continuing to study these important processes today, we're all to some extent following in Joyce's footsteps. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. That's great. Now we come to the branching of the ways and Joyce's interest in India and the Indian drive for independence from Britain in the era of World War II. Now, before I bring Miti up, who will tell you exactly what this means, I would just point out that when Joyce took up this topic, generally speaking, the American Academy was pretty Anglophile. And the notion of studying the Japanese army and its relation with Indian freedom fighters in India against the British in World War II was hardly the sort of thing that would make one a marquee figure in the academy. Yet she did it. Now, as you contemplate that, you'll hear more from Miti Mukherjee, my colleague in Indian history, who has been on the faculty here, I was shocked to learn, about 20 years now. It's amazing. 2001, okay, so it's not quite 20, okay, so a mere 16. Because I still think of you as a junior colleague, and I shouldn't. In fact, Miti's work is immensely distinguished. She has had, I'll just read it off. Research support from the Mellon Foundation, the University of Chicago, the University of Colorado, 12 research grants by actual count this afternoon, and is currently a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies for the present academic year. She has been a remarkably productive colleague, a remarkably successful teacher, and is the author of a book, In India in the Shadows of Empire, a Legal and Political History, 1774 to 1950, as well as articles in scholarly journals, including one on Gandhi, nonviolence, and the concept of freedom in modern India, which appeared in the American Historical Review, our profession's journal of record, which itself would have been a remarkable accomplishment for a scholar who was at that point not yet tenured. Miti is at present at work on the life of Radhabinod Pal, an eminent Indian jurist of the 20th century and pioneering critic of modern international law as a product of Western imperialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. She will guide us through Joyce's work on the history of India and resistance to empire in the era of World War II.
Thank you very much, Fred, for that very kind introduction. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak about Joyce Lebra's work today. Joyce has been a dear friend and inspiration for over a decade, not just as a brilliant, trend-setting Asian historian, but also as one of the wisest, most courageous, and compassionate human beings I know. Also, she's the only historian I know who flew her own plane in a long-distance solo flight to a conference of the Association for Asian Studies in Lawrence, Kansas. This was in 1963, a demonstration of the unique kind of daring that she has shown both in her personal life and in her scholarship. Joyce's prolific career touches many countries and cultures, but as an Indian historian, I'll focus on her contributions to modern Indian history. Joyce is a pioneer in several fields of history writing: the history of Indian anti-colonialism and nationalism, the history of transnational political and military formations in Asia, and the history of women in India and Asia. Far ahead of their times, her path-breaking works, beginning in the 1960s, opened up whole new historiographical horizons, the significance of which is being increasingly recognized by historians in India and the US today. Her historiographical breakthroughs more than 5 decades ago anticipated in many ways the direction in which history writing in India is moving today. Joyce's work in India focused on 2 legendary figures in the history of India's fight against Imperial Britain: Subhash Chandra Bose, who, in alliance with the Japanese, led his Indian National Army in a battle against the British Indian Empire during the Second World War, and Rani Lakshmi Bai, the Queen of Jhansi, one of the major leaders in the 1857 rebellion against British rule, sometimes referred to as India's first war of independence. Separated by a century, there was much in common between Bose and Lakshmi Bai. Both fought for India's independence from British rule. Both were committed to the use of military force to oust the British, despite the knowledge that they were no match for the mightiest military empire at the time. And both died in the fight against British rule, acquiring mythical status in the popular Indian imagination, particularly in the post-colonial period. Significantly, Bose himself recognized his affinity with the Queen, naming the women's regiment of the Indian National Army the Rani of Jhansi Regiment. This is her, you can see. What is also extraordinary about these 2 legendary figures is that despite their popularity amongst the masses, both have been, until recently, by and large ignored by dominant Indian historical scholarship. This is because of the assumptions underlying the two main historiographical narratives on Indian independence. While the nationalist narrative is anchored on the claim that Indian independence could be attributed exclusively to the nonviolent resistance movement led by Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, the imperial narrative has held that granting India independence in 1947 was an act of benevolence on the part of the British Empire, referred to in Indian historiography as the transfer of power. In both these narratives, the role of war and armed resistance against British rule through the 2 centuries of its stay in India have been completely marginalized. Joyce's works on Subhash Bose, the Indian National Army, and the Rani of Jhansi starting in the 1960s were path-breaking in emphasizing the importance of militant struggle in the story of India's independence and in demonstrating the inadequacy of the 2 dominant narratives. Equally important, she showed through meticulous archival research in India and Japan that the story of India's freedom could not be told through a narrow nationalist frame, that larger transnational forces and movements had played a key role in anti-colonial movements in India and Asia more generally. While global and transnational history have become mainstream today, Joyce broke new ground in this field over a century back. Over half a century back, It's increasingly being recognized by historians today that Bose's Indian National Army may have played a critical role in the British decision to leave India in 1947. Joyce's book, Jungle Alliance, Japan and the Indian National Army, published in 1971, is a foundational and indispensable work on this fascinating and overlooked period of the Indian independence struggle. Formed in 1942 in Singapore under Captain Mohan Singh, the core of the Indian National Army, or Azad Hind Fauj, were 55,000 Indian soldiers of the British Indian Army who had been taken as prisoners of war by the Japanese after the surrender of British Indian forces in Singapore and subsequently set free to form their own army against the British. It was under the leadership of Subhash Chandra Bose, the popular Indian politician who arrived in Singapore in 1943, that the INA became a strong fighting force. Large numbers of Indian plantation workers, both men and women, from Singapore, British Malaya, and other parts of Southeast Asia, joined these prisoners of war to participate in the cause of Indian freedom. With the help of the Japanese and Burmese armies, the INA in March of 1944 launched an invasion of British India and advanced as far as Imphal, but was subsequently forced to retreat by the British Indian Army. Even as the war ended disastrously for the INA, and Bose himself is said to have died in a plane crash on his way to the Soviet Union, what unfolded in India as a result of the INA invasion had far-reaching consequences for British rule. In what turned out to be a very short-sighted decision, the British decided to court-martial 3 INA soldiers, Prem Kumar Sehgal, Shahnawaz Khan, and Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, who were all friends of Joyce, on the charge of high treason for defecting from the British Indian Army, joining the Indian National Army, and subsequently waging war against the King Emperor of India. What had started out as a public trial of 3 INA officers, however, soon turned into a riveting trial of the empire itself, both within the law court and, more importantly, in the court of public opinion. Soon after the trial commenced, a nationwide mass movement began in support of these 3 officers. The accused were declared heroes in the fight for independence, and pictures of Subhash Bose began to appear everywhere, draped in garlands of flowers. Even though the 3 accused were ultimately convicted in the courtroom, the British Empire lost the case in the public sphere. Soon after the trial, Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian Forces, recognizing the danger, commuted the sentences of all 3 accused INA and set them free. As the trial ended, the British Empire found itself faced with mass hostility, unprecedented in its scale. Widespread mutinous disaffection broke out in the Royal Indian Navy and units of the British Indian Army and the Royal Indian Air Force, accompanied by mass public agitation against British rule. Coming in the heels of Gandhi's Quit India movement in 1942, this nationalist fervor, which swept across the armed forces, convinced the British Indian government that it could no longer rely on the allegiance of the Indian armed forces that had played a decisive role in the acquisition and preservation of empire, not only in India, but also throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. As Michael Edwards eloquently put it, the ghost of Subhash Bose, like Hamlet's father, walked the battlements of the Red Fort, and his suddenly amplified figure overawed the conferences that were to lead to independence. Not surprisingly, within 2 years, the rule of the British Empire over India finally came to an end. In recent years in India, popular interest in both Subhash Bose and the Queen of Jhansi have soared. Much of the public curiosity on Bose is related to the circumstances of his death. Much of scholarly opinion holds that Subhash Chandra Bose died in a plane crash on August 18, 1945, in Japan-occupied Formosa, now Taiwan. He was on his way to the Soviet Union to continue the war for Indian independence. However, significant sections of public opinion in India today remain extremely skeptical of this account of Bose's death. The gravity of the skepticism compelled the post-colonial government of India to devise a transparent process through which a definitive resolution of this long-standing controversy could be reached. The post-colonial Indian government was compelled to set up 3 commissions of inquiry, including the Shahnawaz Commission in 1956, the Khosla Commission in 1970, and the Justice Mukherjee Commission in 1999 to investigate Bose's death. But their findings are conflicting and have not resolved the debate. Recently, the government of India has started to make some of the classified documents relating to Bose's last years public. While the controversy rages on, there's no doubt that both Subhash Bose and the Queen of Jhansi have emerged in public discourse in India as pivotal characters in the narrative of Indian independence in recent years in India. Historians are increasingly beginning to realize the critical importance of Bose and the INA in the anti-colonial struggle for independence, and archival research is beginning to move in the direction pointed out by Joyce in the 1960s. It goes to Joyce's credit that she saw the significance of these figures and these events at a time when very few historians were working on these themes, and in the process, she blazed new directions in Indian historiography. Apart from military and transnational political history, Joyce has also been a pioneer in the field of modern Indian women's history. In Women Against the Raj, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, published in 2008, Joyce added to the fascinating story of the INA by studying Indian women who took up arms against the Raj, many of whom were teenagers working in Malayan rubber plantations who fought for Indian freedom without ever having set foot on India. This work followed an earlier path-breaking work on women's history entitled The Rani of Jhansi, a study of female heroism in India, published in 1988, in which Joyce meticulously collected ballads, poetry, folk tales, and folk art to show how Queen Lakshmi Bai, who's also known as the Joan of Arc of modern India, was transformed into a mythical figure in the popular imagination. Joyce also wrote a novel, Durga's Sword, on the Queen in 1995. There's so much more that I can talk about with regard to Joyce's contributions, but I'll end here, and I want to end with some words of tribute to Joyce by leading members of the Indian intelligentsia that I just received. I'll start with Krishna Bose, who's the chairperson of Netaji Research Bureau and a former member of Indian Parliament. She's also the wife of late Shishir Kumar Bose, who was Subhash Bose's nephew. Krishna Bose writes, my dear husband, Dr. Shishir Kumar Bose, and I have known Joyce since the early 1960s and have followed her research on the INA and the Rani of Jhansi regiment with keen interest. I was so impressed when I read her book, Jungle Alliance. I was fortunate to be present and also participated in the launch of her book on the Rani of Jhansi regiment in Singapore. Joyce has brought into light the glorious chapter of India's fight for freedom from colonial rule under the leadership of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, which ultimately brought liberation of Asia from European imperialism. Another letter of tribute, Major General G.D. Bakshi, who has written many important historical works on the Indian Army, and most recently written a book on Subhash Bose and the INA called The Indian Samurai. He writes, Joyce Chapman Lebra is truly the doyen of all studies of the war in East Asia. The sheer sweep and scope of her studies is awe-inspiring, and her insights are astounding. Finally, Sugato Bose, professor of modern South Asian history at Harvard University and grandnephew of Subhash Chandra Bose, writes, one of the most distinguished American historians of Asia, Joyce's reputation is as high in India and Japan as it is in the United States. She has made innovative and path-breaking contributions in the field of international history, military history, and women's history. Joyce's book, Jungle Alliance, Japan and the Indian National Army, published more than 40 years ago, remains one of the finest studies of Asia in the Second World War. Her study on Japanese-trained armies in Southeast Asia is essential reading for students of anti-colonial nationalism in South and Southeast Asia. Her book, The Rani of Jhansi, A Study in Female Heroism in India, is both a superb analysis of resistance to the British during the 1857 revolt and an astute insight into the creation of a legend. In addition to reading her works, I have heard Joyce speak eloquently at seminars and conferences. I have met her and heard her speak at the first international Netaji seminar organized by the Netaji Research Bureau, Calcutta, in January 1973. She has always been a star draw at historical conferences in India. She's an internationally recognized historian of rare stature. Thank you very much. You're an inspiration.
And I'm back. The next speaker, Marcia Yonemoto, is here, I believe, somewhere in the room. Ah, there you are, Marcia. Come on up. I want to just embarrass you a little bit while I'm. She is this was the one that I was most astonished at when I realized when you joined the department, which was 1995, right? Which was a very long time ago. It seems like yesterday, actually. And I still have a hard time realizing that you have become, well, you're on the cusp at least of becoming a full professor because you seem so young to me. And that seems like an august rank, but fully deserved, but one that nonetheless you're much too young to occupy. Marcia is the director of the graduate teacher program at CU. She is in the fall of, she is the author of Mapping Early Modern Japan, Space, Place, and Culture in the Tokugawa Era, 2003, which won 2 prizes. And her most recent work, The Problem of Women in Early Modern Japan, published in 2016, is too new to have won anything yet, but the signs look favorable. So I would like to introduce you to Marcia, who will talk about, on behalf, I guess, of the Teaching East Asia program, right? Will be that will be part of your discussion. Okay, well, I would welcome you to the lectern and just say that one last thing, that in all that we've heard, Joyce's flexibility, her remarkable range, this all had very serious implications for her teaching, which is to say that unlike people who just go down the mine and stay there and teach the same 2 or 3 courses their whole careers, Joyce has taught Japanese history and Indian history and dozens of courses within each. And that is simply demonstration that no good deed goes unpunished. And I think now perhaps we'll hear more about that topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. So I am actually going to, before I say a few words of my own about how Joyce has influenced my own career in my life here at CU, I wanted to bring up some distinguished senior colleagues who asked asked to speak about Joyce and who know her from much far before I showed up here, even though when I showed up here it was already almost 22 years ago. So Jim Jankowski, Professor Jankowski is Professor Emeritus in the History Department. He is a distinguished historian of the Middle East. His research specialty was Egypt, but he, for many, many years, was our only historian of the Middle East, and he is one of Joyce's, I think, most senior colleagues. So,
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you. Thank you. Joyce came to CU in 1962. I came in 1966. We've been colleagues and friends for over 50 years. Wow. I want to reflect a bit on those early years with Joyce. We were both specialists in what was called the Third World, with Earl Swisher, a veteran historian of China. Joyce and I team taught a course, History of Eastern Civilizations, if you can imagine that, a sweeping, if not impossible, survey of Japanese, Chinese, South Asian, Middle Eastern history, everything you wanted to know about the other in only 2 semesters. On a broader scale, these were difficult years for a number of reasons. It was a period of turmoil nationally, internationally, and on campus, an era of protests, meetings, and free universities on the lawn. As a scholar dealing with Asia, Joyce was frequently called upon to comment. She never shirked those responsibilities, was an active participant in the political turmoil of the late 60s and early 70s. Within the department, Joyce, Earl, and myself, later joined by Jim Wolfe, dealing with Africa, formed a little army of 3 within a sea of Americanists and Europeanists. While we certainly formed personal friendships within the department, we had to look to faculty in other departments, such as political science, religious studies, anthropology, art history, for professional interaction and stimulation. The kind of collaborative support and assistance available at CU today, interdisciplinary support and assistance, was largely not available to us. And I think Joyce's broadening career is remarkable in view of that circumstance. As the only woman in the department for over a decade, Joyce faced burdens that I didn't have to bear. It was, put it mildly, it was a different academic environment back then, one to which that noted historian Bill O'Reilly would have been comfortable. Finally, the university as a whole had a somewhat different set of scholarly standards and expectations, one where Joyce's seminal research in the history of both Japan and India was, in my view, both underappreciated and underrewarded for many years. Through it all, Joyce persevered, continuing with her research as well as her involvement in social issues. Indeed, in the early 1970s, she broadened her research to encompass issues of gender, becoming a pioneer in 3 different areas. It's been a remarkable career by a brave, forthright, committed individual. It's been a privilege to work with you, Joyce.
Thank you, Jim. And now Bob Ferry. Bob Ferry is a professor in the history department. He is a specialist on Latin America, colonial Latin America. And Bob has the unique position of Bob was an undergrad at CU before he went off to graduate school in Michigan, came back as a professor. So he was, Minnesota, I'm so sorry, Minnesota. Those big Midwestern states. I'm from California. The big Midwestern states. I get confused. I'm sorry, Minnesota. Before he came back as a professor and as an undergrad I think you're going to talk about, was in this course that Joyce and Jim and Earl Swisher taught. So, Bob Ferry.
Well, that's true. That I was in that course 50 years ago this semester. I was a sophomore. But I'm not here. The reason why I'm here is because about a month ago, Marcia mentioned in a history meeting on a Friday afternoon that this event was taking place, and if any of us had something we thought we would like to say, that we should come forward. And I never intended to come forward and say anything, but I had this, the next morning, Saturday morning, I wrote to Marcia some thoughts about Joyce, and Marcia suggested that you might like to hear some of those comments. So I'm going to read to you an edited, shorter version of an email that I wrote on a Saturday morning, but this is my first impression when called upon to think about Joyce. This is what I believe Joyce did for this department, for the history department, or perhaps just for me, that ought to be recognized. The sexism and misogyny she experienced and the fight she carried on against them was important and a long-lasting lesson. Because we haven't talked about it for some time and I don't remember as well as I'd like to, I can't speak definitively for my assistant professor cohort of the 1980s. Some of them are here, Fred and Lee. But I'm sure that we would agree that Joyce's struggles to get salary equity and fair treatment generally made the principles of gender equality very real to all of us. No doubt, I know this is to be true, Lee Chambers and Virginia Anderson had their own struggles, as did Barbara Engel and Marjorie McIntosh certainly. But Joyce, being Joyce, brought hers directly before the department. As she publicly pushed back against that entrenched male tradition, her opponents, rallying together, issued not so subtle invitations to a young male professor to share their view, to join their club. I've not quite forgotten those pre-tenure tensions of which this circumstance was, in my case, not a small feature. I'm satisfied with the stand, perhaps that's too dramatic a word, that I took then, with help from my wife Melvide, whom Joyce had befriended, and others like Steve Epstein and Jim Jankowski. But I owe it to Joyce for having called me out, in effect, and for creating in many of us, I'm supposing, a determination to make sure that her difficulties would not be repeated. A lot more had to be done and is still being done on this point, and I don't want to take away from the efforts of my colleagues. But way more than just being the first woman hired by history, Joyce was the embattled founder of the effort for gender equity in our department. Probably progress would have been made in any event, but the context of that progress at CU is all about Joyce Lebra, and we owe her a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. My colleagues have done an excellent job of talking about Joyce's scholarship in both Japanese and Indian history, so although I'm a Japanese historian, I'm not going to talk about that. I would like, before I give my own little talk, I want to speak on behalf of Lynn Parisi, who is here, but who is being uncharacteristically shy and retiring and wants me to give her testimony in her place. But Lynn is, where is Lynn? Lynn is back there. Lynn Parisi is director of the Teaching East Asia program, which is a nationally award-winning program for developing Asian studies curricula in K through 12 schools. And it's a wonderful program. All of us who teach in the Asia fields at CU have worked with Lynn for years, worked with teachers, and had some really wonderful experiences with developing these materials that are now being taught in schools all around the country. But Lynn, when she learned that this event was going to be held, wrote to me and with this anecdote, which is quite wonderful and I think indicative of Joyce's efforts to teach about Asia and Japan outside of the university context. So in 1984, Lynn was trying to build a K through 12 outreach program in Asian studies at a private nonprofit, which was then called the Rocky Mountain Japan Project, located here in Boulder. TEA is now part of CU, but at that time it was separate. And she and her staff had decided to apply for a Fulbright grant to take 20 primary and secondary school teachers to Japan on a study tour. And they needed a scholar to lead that tour. And so not knowing anyone at CU, they sort of cold called Joyce and asked her if they made an appointment, they went to see her in her office, and as Lynn writes, amazingly, she agreed to sign on as the scholar for this group Fulbright for 20 Colorado teachers. They went to Japan for 4 weeks, and as Lynn says, it was fantastic, which is really saying something, because anytime you take 20 of anybody who have never been mostly to Japan, things can go very bad very quickly. And so the fact that it was fantastic for 4 weeks is pretty amazing. And the next year after that, in 1985, they received the Rocky Mountain Japan Project, received a 3-year grant from the Japan Foundation, and that was the start of Teaching East Asia, which has gone on to be this amazing resource. I should tell one more anecdote about when they were in Japan. Joyce and the teachers and Lynn, they were at the International House in Tokyo having lunch, and the International House is this venerable institution where lots of foreign scholars stay, especially those with large research budgets, and you see all sorts of august people wandering the halls there. And while they were having lunch, Joyce spied Ezra Vogel, who was a very eminent sociologist at Harvard, whom she had known from her Harvard days, and she collared him and sort of commandeered, compelled, coerced him into having lunch with the 20 teachers, and which ended up being a great experience, but would not have happened without Joyce. So, as Lynn writes, Joyce was instrumental to our programs in the early years, and also, therefore, was instrumental in K-12 Asian Studies programming in Colorado. And Lynn wanted to mention this as a way to commend Joyce for her career that went far beyond the campus at CU. So thanks to Lynn, and thank you, Joyce. I just wanted to say, and to build on Bob Ferry's very eloquent testimony about the efforts that Joyce made in terms of gender equity in our department. I joined the faculty in 1995. I was not Joyce's immediate successor. There was another faculty member who was here for a short time between the time Joyce retired and the time I came. But I guess I'm her first permanent, or more or less long-term successor. And as Bob alluded to, Joyce faced many challenges in her time at CU, and when I came here, she reached out to me. We had many wonderful conversations, and she told me a lot about what had gone on. And in many ways, it's a measure of the efforts of Joyce and my senior women colleagues in the history department and my senior male colleagues, that things had changed so substantially by the time I got here in 1995. Because when I joined the faculty, gender relations, gender equity issues were talked about more as a kind of good point, a sort of point of pride in the department, if anything. And that was because already by 1995, about half of the faculty in the history department were women. And not only that, faculty were distributed up and down the seniority ranks from assistant to associate to full. And in 1995, that was unusual because you tended to see in a lot of institutions, especially large research institutions, women faculty grouped at the junior level. And that wasn't the case here. And just speaking personally, that made a huge difference to me as a young woman starting out, barely 30 years old at the time, in a new job, fresh out of graduate school. I had senior women colleagues I could talk to, I could consult, I could get advice from, and senior male colleagues. But the thing about the department, and so people would talk about that a lot when I first got here, how unusual it was that we had this faculty that was half women. But after a while, it just became normal that we had women, that we had senior women, that we had women in positions of power in the department. And here's a very interesting, telling fact. In my 22 years on the faculty, the history department has had 2 chairs who are not women, AKA men. 2. Because we believe in affirmative action, the next chair of the history department will be a man. Paul Sutter will take over from Lil Fenn this summer. That's not the only reason he's been elected chair, certainly. He has many, many attributes other than his Y chromosome. But it's an amazing fact. And that, I think, goes maybe in a sort of winding way, winds its way back to Joyce and back to our many distinguished women colleagues. And I guess, so that for me is one of Joyce's great legacies and gifts to all of us here. And just one last thing is that the presence of women in our department has become so normalized that I only realized as I was preparing some remarks to give today, that CU's history department is, I think, unique in that we have 3 historians of Japan, which is a lot. every one of us necessary. I don't mean to say that we're overstaffed, but we have 3 historians of Japan. All 3 of us are women. There's no other university that I can think of where there are 3 historians of Japan, all of whom are women. I can think of 2 that have 2 women. Wisconsin has 2 women, historians of Japan. Michigan has 2 women, historians of Japan, but not 3. And not 3 who are in a legacy of 5, started by Joyce, then Martha Toko, then myself, Miriam, and Sung-Yun Lim, who is also here. So Joyce is the founding mother of this gynocracy of Japanese history, if that's not a word, it should be, of Japanese history, that I think really is unusual in our field. And it's telling, again, how normalized that has become, that I only realized it now. But thank you, Joyce. Thank you for everything you have done and for the exemplar that you have been to all of us.
And now, at last, we've reached the end of the faculty. You can applaud if you like. We have one more speaker who has come a very long way to be here today. I think many of you have come a long way. One from Argentina, this particular speaker from Japan. And this is David Wagner, who will come to the lectern and say some words of a very personal sort about Joyce, whom he's known for quite a while. David?
Well, it's a tremendous honor to be here, and quite a surprise to be standing up here today, because this afternoon Joyce approached me when I came by her house and asked me if I wouldn't read a few words from one of her students, graduate students, which I'll do in just a moment. But I want to take the opportunity to also add to some of the commentary that's been made, because I'm really pleased to hear so much of this focus was on what's been done for women. And I've known Joyce about 30 years. My mother was a feminist. They were friends. And it's been a pleasure to see what she's been able to do at this institution, not only academically, but also for women. One other comment from things that I've heard today, and I've learned a lot about Joyce that I didn't know. The Mishima experience in 1970, a few years ago I was talking with Joyce, and I realized that no one ever recorded the evolution of how that event happened from her perspective, how she was in the library that day, how the approach to the New York Times occurred, and what happened subsequently, when she traveled around different parts of Asia. So I put together a film crew, and it just so happened that another academic, Donald Keene, professor of literature from Columbia, was in Tokyo at the same time, and she was in Tokyo for her 88th birthday, which was, it's called Beiju in Japanese, which is a very special event. So I put together a crew, sat them down together. She was there the day he committed suicide, but Donald Keene knew him as a friend for almost 20 years. So it's on film. Google it, Donald Keene, Joyce Lebra, 2012, and take a look at it. I'd like to read very briefly some comments that were written in an email from one of her students in the early 70s. We couldn't find out which year exactly, but his name is Ken Whitney. And I think he lives in London right now. So I'm going to read a few of these words, which I think sort of sums up who Joyce is and what she's done. And I'm also pleased to see that we get a view from the student side of this event. So let me just read. Sorry if I don't have tremendous eye contact during this process. So in the middle of the email it says, coming back from Japan with many impressions and fragments of information, you created the framework for a deeper picture on a broader canvas of Japanese history. As the small piece of paper I did for you on haiku allowed me to see the form culturally and historically. You set me on a journey of a lifetime, and for a lifetime associated with and focused on Japan. I found what I lacked before, a purpose, a challenge, an opportunity. Without you, this would not have happened. 35 years living within a society prepared by you to appreciate its nuances and its traditions. Joyce, you have not been forgotten, nor will you be. with such scholarship and with a life so well lived, and with a focus on others, I hope you feel nothing but pride on this day and all the others who come to experience this day with you. So, yeah, it's wonderful. So Fred and I talked a few minutes ago about what happens at this particular point in the exercise, and we decided it would be nice if I brought her on stage to make a few words. So Joyce, would you like to come up and give us some commentary from your perspective?
I'm really overwhelmed, and I also forgot my cane today. I'm overwhelmed by this amazing honor and very grateful. I want to say grateful to all of you who have come, and especially to Dean Williams, to my colleagues for these overly kind words. And I'm especially grateful to the Northern Library, to the staff of Northern Library, and especially to Andrew, who has, with his extraordinary artistic talent, created this amazing exhibit. Andrew, mahalo, aloha, mualoha. Thank you all. Thank you so much. I want to say a couple more things. I have friends who've come here from a very long way. Masako, sitting here in the front with me, has come all the way from Argentina, and she stayed with me as a graduate student when she was 23, many decades ago. And David, where are you, David? David and Nami came from Tokyo, and Bob Atada was one of my first, Bob here was one of my first students at CU in 1962, and he came from Oregon for this event. Also, this is historically important. Charlene is here. She's the granddaughter of Mohan Singh, the founder of the Indian National Army. She's his granddaughter, and she's come with her family today. I attended her 3-day wedding in Memphis, how many years ago? 15 years ago. It was a great event. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.